golongtd.com, humanizing pro football journalism.
Oh man, am I so excited for this conversation. I don't even know where to begin with Chuck Pollock, but if you're watching this, if you're listening, the gentleman right here on the Go Long podcast has meant so much to me on a personal level. Chuck, honestly, there is a 0.0001% chance that I'm, sitting here covering the NFL, running my own shop if you're not in my life. So it's an honor to have you on this show, and we're going to go down memory lane. But for those who don't know, Chuck is the preeminent dean of all things Buffalo Bills sports coverage on the beat, starting as far back as 1973, I believe. Is that right, Chuck?
Right.
And we first connected, I think it was 6th or 7th grade. I went to the Olean Times Herald for a little career project and took some pictures. You showed me the printing presses, and you said, hey, when you turn 16, let's bring you in here as an intern. And a few years later, you gave me a call.
Well, and that was, it was very clear to me, even when you were 13, how invested you were in making this your career. And when I couldn't hire you until you were 16. And you proved so fast, and I know you tell people this all the time, but you proved so fast that you were such a strong writer that when you were 16 years old, you said, could I do some columns on the NBA, which I now hate. Excuse me, after covering them for 5.5 years in the 70s, I loved it, the game now. Now I can't watch it. And you turned out one great column after another, and the biggest convincing I had to do to you was not show everything you knew, every column, that you could do a good 750 words. You didn't need 2,000, and people are going to read your stuff because they realize it's so well written.
I just think back to those times too, Chuck. Like, you've got a 16-year-old there working the desk, and we're taking the calls right until 11, 12 o'clock and doing high school sports. And then I just say, hey, can I write a column about the Detroit Pistons in 2004? Honestly, the greatest gift you ever gave me, Chuck, was just saying yes, saying go for it. Right. And we'd sit down and we'd go over it line by line. And I learned so much in that setting. But I think you just encouraged me at every step, every turn, when I think so many sports editors with your experience easily could have just said no and discouraged, an intern to write an NBA column or an NFL column at that age instead of taking those high school calls. But I mean, you just let me do all the above, and I'm just like forever indebted to you, Chuck.
Well, I will tell you, and you already know this, Tyler, and actually you worked with one of the people back then. She was Rachel George. So we had some really strong interns, but over the years, the late Jennifer Fry worked for me, Mike Vaccaro worked for me, Woj worked for me as a part-time intern, and Brian Moritz, and just some really strong people. And they unfairly, like yourself, give me more credit than I deserve. The only credit I'll take is that I was smart enough to see the skills in you people and let you write. Because shame on me if you didn't, because look at where your lives have gone. So yeah, it was a thrill for me to let you do it. And the thing about it is you made the most of it. Plus, I didn't have to write about the NBA.
Well, it was a hell of a time, man. I honestly, we could sit here and just stroll down memory lane, those Times Herald nights with Jim Malaro, Tom Roof, Brian Moritz, obviously still a close friend with Brian, just an unbelievable human being. Vinny Pezzamente, all the interns, even Tim Bontemps, right? We see him covering the NBA at ESPN. We went to rival high schools back in the day, Elkville and Randolph.
Yeah, exactly.
It's great. Well, it's awesome to have you here. Be careful what you wish for, because you're probably going to become a recurring guest. I'm going to be, convincing you and baiting you and fooling you into coming onto this podcast, because this is going to be so much fun. I just thought it'd be great to, you think about Bills fans today, and you've got a generation like, my parents and folks in their 50s, 60s, 70s really hold on to those Super Bowl teams, right? The early 90s. That's the heyday. And then you've got the generation of the drought. People that remember the 17 years of Rob Johnson, friend of the program, obviously, Todd Collins, J.P. Losman, E.J. Manuel, Kelly Holcomb. Go right down the list. There were a few quarterbacks there. And then now you've got this current era, and they're on the Super Bowl doorstep. But the teams that get lost are all those teams, before the 90s. And nobody knows those teams better than Chuck Pollock here. And it was a different time covering the NFL then. I mean, we were getting into it a little bit before we hit record, but man, I just want to give you the floor, Chuck. What was it really like when you first got onto the beat covering the Bills at the Times Herald in the early 70s?
Well, I started at the paper in 1973, and I had done nothing but radio until that point. And Mike Abdo and Bob Davies, who were running the department, said, we need a guy. Chuck Ward, who I replaced, and he was the Bills beat guy, was going to go cityside and become the managing editor. So they said, well, the job is this: to be covering the Bills home and away, to be writing the columns about the Bonnies, and you'll also be covering the Buffalo Braves home games, and if they make the playoffs, on the road. That was hard to turn down, but it was a leap of faith for me. And they had told me, Bob and Mike, we'll teach you to write. Well, they never did, because they realized, and this, one of the most famous phrases in our business is, write the way you talk, only better. Well, I was a broadcast guy. I was a verbal guy. And so I had a voice, and they realized it right away. And so I got kind of weaned on how things worked in the NFL heading into the 73 season, including the draft, which, Tyler, and I know people now, they say, well, yeah, you got to be kidding. But in 73, the draft was held in the late morning and early afternoon, 2 consecutive days, 17 rounds. Nothing at night, no prime time, no nothing like that. So I was used to that. So I went to the first practice of the training camp in 73, and it was at Niagara University. Niagara didn't even have a football field. They had temporary goalposts. So I'm walking in, and by total coincidence, I end up next to Joe Ferguson, who was their third-round draft choice from Arkansas. But it was his first practice because he had played in a fiasco called the College Football All-Star Game. And what that was the best player from that previous fall season playing the defending Super Bowl champion. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, when I think of that now, it's so absurd. What did I in there? And so the Bills also had a linebacker from Penn State, John Scorpan. He was there. So I'm walking next to Fergie, and he was just not a big guy. They listed him at 6'1", 195, and that was a joke. He was basically 6 feet, $180. But he had a major league arm. So we're walking out on the field, and out on the field, probably 40 yards away, is J.D. Hill, who was the Bills' number 1 wide receiver selection in 1971. And he looked up and said, "Hey, rookie, over here." Well, there's a ball laying there. So Fergie picks it up, and he throws a rope that came on J.D. Hill so fast, he almost didn't catch it. It was right between the 4 and the 0 on his jersey. And he catches it. And he said, "My God, that's the first time I've caught a pass that didn't have a bleeping hump in it in 2 years." And his reference was to the Bills quarterback at that time, who was Dennis Shaw. He was a second-round pick in 1970, and he played at San Diego State, and he just threw balloon after balloon. And the first time I went to a Bills game, Chuck Ward took me to the last regular season game of 1972 at War Memorial Stadium. And Dennis Shaw was the quarterback, and the people in the press box were just laughing out loud at his passes. So that's the reason they brought Fergie there. But it was an eye-opening experience because practice ended, and I walked onto the field. Lou Saban was standing there if I wanted to talk to him. O.J. Simpson was over there if I wanted to talk to him. Wasn't a big crowd. Basically, back then it was Rick Azar, Van Miller, and Eddie Kilgore, myself, a couple guys from the Buffalo News, and a guy from Rochester. There was nobody. There was no security. There was nothing. You could do what you want. And I think about this now. About the second practice I went to, one day, this guy comes driving onto the field in a golf cart with a Santa Claus suit. And it's Tony Marchetti, who was a ill-tempered equipment man. And he had two huge tubs of beer on ice at the end of practice. And I swear every player on that field wanted to kiss him that day. But can you imagine that happening now? I mean, it's absurd. So, I started to get used to the way things worked. But that was 1973, the season Rich Stadium opened, the season that Juice ran for 2003. And the very first game that year was in Schaefer Stadium in Foxborough, which was a piece of crap. And all you need to know is Rich Stadium cost $22 million at the time, which is laughable. And Schaefer Stadium cost $6 million, and it probably wasn't worth that. So anyway, here I am on the team playing, and the roster was small. The roster then was only 40. And get this, Lou Saban's staff was 6 assistant coaches. Now, John McDermott has over 20, as do most of the head coaches in the NFL these days. 6. So we're on the team plane. We get on one of the 2 buses, and just by coincidence, I was on the same bus with Juice. So we get off and we walk onto the field, and it was known that Schaefer Stadium had awful, brutally hard turf. So we all walked out to the middle field, and OJ reached in his pocket and pulled out a quarter, and he flipped it, and it hit the turf and bounced up almost to his hip. And he just looked at all of us and said, "Now that is some hard shit." So all he did was run for 250 that day, and that was an NFL record at the time. Bills won big, 31-13 or something like that. The fullback, Larry Watkins, ran for $138. And right then you realized Saban was not going to be doing any stuff with Dennis Shaw. He was on the bench, but Fergie played every game, and people don't realize 14-game schedule. Fergie only threw 162 passes that year, 162, barely 12 a game. And but they made pretty good use of the running game. And so it was a very interesting introduction to how things would go. And OJ got to the 14th game, and it was snowing at Shea Stadium hard. And he needed to get 186 yards to break Jim Brown's record. And he just starts piling up yards and yards and yards. And all of a sudden, he's in the fourth quarter. And they run a short sweep. And he's got his 2003. They win the game. And afterward, it was interesting. This was so OJ. He brought the whole offensive line into the locker room where the interview area was. And he said, "I want you to meet some friends of mine." It was really very emblematic of the appreciation he had for that, really a front six, because Paul Seymour, the tight end, was actually a third tackle. And it was very enlightening to me that he was such a team guy. And it's weird. The biggest paradox of my career covering the Bills was finding out there were 2 O.J. Simpsons. He was absolutely the most charismatic athlete I've ever met, unquestioned. And that year, he's on his way to 2,003 yards. So he was the story every single game. And I remember one home game, he was standing in his locker. And back then, this isn't when you're sitting in front of a logo backdrop with a microphone. You're around the locker. That was it. And he was talking to us, and he had a film crew in there that was doing a documentary on him. And he was giving instructions to the audio people and the visual people, talking to us and talking with his teammates. And he juggled all these things seamlessly. So I was amazed. You know, he's setting up dinner at the Cloisters, a restaurant that you might not be familiar with, but was very famous in Buffalo in the day. And it was a remarkable experience watching him do all of this. And nobody ever told him that his self wasn't a word, but he's pretty eloquent when he talked to us. But he would go talk to other players, other black players, especially the ones in what they call the ghetto, which is where the defensive backs were. And he'd go over there and talk street talk to them, and then come back with a different voice in it. So he was a remarkable character. And if you had said to me, one of the things in this guy's persona is a double murder, I would have been totally incredulous. I mean, I would.
I mean, I think that multi-part series doc, I mean, it's the best sports documentary that I've ever seen. It was unbelievable. I mean, it opened up my eyes, opened up millions of eyes to that transformation. I don't even know what you even call it. But O.J. Simpson was on top of the sports world. I mean, there's no way anybody could have detected anything. I mean, did you have a relationship with him when it's that intimate on the beat and you're getting to know these players? Did you get to know O.J. Simpson?
That happened with a lot of the players, Tyler, and that's one of the sad things now. Now, I now write for two websites. It hasn't quite started yet, but I'm going to write for the Olean Star. I already write for the Wellsville Sun, but basically I do columns. In fact, I gave up my credential to Bills games last year. I thought I can do what I want to do here at home. I don't have to take somebody else's credential. But back then, you knew the players by name. They knew you by name. And it was just, and again, it was not as big a roster, of course, but I was just amazed at how things changed. And because he was so approachable by everybody. And I remember, in 1976, the Bills played the Lions in the Pontiac Dome. And Joe Ferguson was hurt. So they had a backup quarterback named Gary Morangi. And a lot of people thought Gary should have been the starter. And by default, he started that game. And OJ ran for a new record and there's no such thing as setting an old record, I realize, but he set a record above his own when he ran for 275 yards. That was the best in the NFL history at the time. And meanwhile, Gary Morangi could not have struggled more. He went 4 for 21 with a pick, 29 yards. And I think he got sacked like 5 times. And 3 of the completions of the 4 went to Bob Chandler, who was as nice a human being as you could ever ask. And actually, he was on the team because of OJ. He was a teammate of OJ's at USC, and he suggested they drafted him. I think they took him in the 7th round. And he was just one of those classic white possession receivers who you just need when you got field stretchers as well. And he was the target on almost every one of those 21 passes. And he got tagged and tagged and tagged most of the time because Gary overthrew him. And I went in the locker room And I said, I felt horrible for him because he's just beaten to hell. And he's taken off his shoulder pads and his back is just nothing but that black and blue. And I said, Bobby, my God, you took a pounding out there. And he said, Chuck, I don't want to talk about it. And I took him so seriously, I couldn't muster a follow-up question. I just walked away because, you know, this guy was, I mean, he sadly died of lung cancer at age 50, but he went out to LA and was a very high-profile daytime TV host. But Juice stole the show there in 76. But that was the season where 5 games in, Bills were 2-3. And I guess Lou just went in by himself and talked to Ralph Wilson, the team owner. He said, Ralph, I got to quit. I've lost the team. And Ralph, somewhat amusingly, said, well, where did you lose him? And he said, no, I can't communicate with them. I can't get to them. And he walked away. And so all of a sudden, Jim Ringo, who was one of those classic guys who was a great coordinator, but not meant to be a head coach, took over for 21 games. And he was coaching that game in Detroit when OJ went nuts. But it was just a mess to have a coach walk away like that. They were one of the most potent offenses in the league. And by that time, they traded Dennis Shaw away, and they had Ahmad Rashad, which was the biggest steal in NFL history. And they had Bobby Chandler, and they had J.D. Hill. They had some forces. And still, they're only throwing 12, 15 times a game, even as that time went on. So it was interesting because in 77, they really kind of hit rock bottom. And so they fired Jim Ringo and they replaced him with Hank Bullock. And Hank Bullock was a very nice man, although he was Mr. Malaprop. He was the guy who would say, well, they took the sail out of our winds and things of that nature. And he'd say that every day, different stuff like that. But he was really nice to deal with. And to give you how weird things were back then, and I can't remember whether this was in 1985 or 86, and they were lousy, obviously. You could go to practice then, although nobody wanted to. To us, it was a sentence that you had to go to practice. But one day, Milt Northrup, who was the beat writer for the Buffalo News at the time, were sitting on one of the steel benches on the sideline, and Hank comes over, sits down between us, picks up a pad, and starts drawing the way they run their receiving tree. You know, 9 being a long ball and 1 being a circle route. And he took some time with us, and practice is going on. And it was vastly interesting to us, but I thought, no, this is peculiar. But so he was replaced by Marv in 86. But I will say, when Jim Ringo was let go after the 77 season, the Bills hired Chuck Knox. And Chuck was fresh off 5 straight NFC West division titles. He went 54, 15, and 1 in the regular season, but he was 3-5. And all of a sudden, he's the Bills coach, and he'd just been extended. Well, the Bills media, print and broadcast, was all in New Orleans for the Super Bowl. For the Dallas-Denver Super Bowl. So they had a press conference for us in the Statler Ballroom, a place that you know well. And
that's right. The site of our wedding, which you attended, Chuck. You and Vic, thanks so much.
That's right. So
Love the Statler.
I'm there with a bunch of peripheral people, news people, but they're news people. And as you know, news people are out of their element in sports circumstances. So I'm sitting there next to a guy named Stan Barron, who was a old-time radio voice, really gravelly voice who did talk shows. And I'm sitting next to him. And I'm thinking, I have got to ask this question because this doesn't make any sense. So I raised my hand. I gave him a microphone and I said, Chuck, you just won 5 division titles. You got an extension. The season ends. And 3 weeks later, you're coach of the Bills. Why would the Bills have any idea you were available? Which I thought was fair. And Stan Barron winds up and he pokes me in the ribs with his elbow and says, Chuck, that's a great question. Well, needless to say, Chuck was the originator of word salads. I mean, he did it before anybody else, I swear. And he said something that made no sense. But it was an interesting circumstance because Chuck was an awfully successful coach, and I was impressed that Ralph Wilson was willing to pay him. But I still thought, why was he available? And then I started to do some research. He had that fantastic record in the regular season. But in the postseason, when he came to the Bills, he was 3-5, including 3-1 on dunks, I think, I recall. And so what bugged the owner at the time, Carol Rosenblum, was that he was very Hollywood. And Chuck was committed to what he called the ground Chuck offense. They just ran and ran and ran. And it was interesting because even when he got to the Bills, he did this. Every Monday morning, he'd take the paper and he'd go through every NFL box score. And he would check how many running attempts the team had. And he would report to us almost every time, hey, 95% of the teams that had 40 carries won the game. And he was married to that. And so that's kind of what he brought to the Bills. And they had Joe Cribbs then, and they could be a pretty effective running team. But Carol Rosenblum wanted no part of it. So, I mean, this isn't funny, but it is amusing how it ended up. He was replaced, Chuck was, in L.A. by Ray Malavasi. And Ray Malavasi won 7 division titles himself. And he got them to the Super Bowl after the 79 season. Unfortunately, Carol Rosenblum drowned under very mysterious circumstances in Los Angeles in the Pacific Ocean before that season. So he never even did get to see the team get as far as he hoped it would. But Chuck really did. The team was so bad. I mean, this is when they're starting to accrue quality players, but first 2 seasons they didn't make the playoffs. The second 2, they made the playoffs, and they went 1-2. I mean, over his career, even after he went to Seattle, he was 7-11 in the postseason. And as good a coach as he was, that was kind of his career indictment. And as a result, he got into the 1982 season, and there were high hopes for that team. They started 2-0, and then the strike came. And they just stumbled thereafter. They finished 4-5. They lost the tiebreaker, and basically Knox pulled a Popeye and said enough is enough and too much is plenty. And he went to Seattle. But all of a sudden, that led to Marv Levy eventually being hired to fill the void after they didn't have Knox, and Kay Stevenson and Hank Bullock, and all of a sudden Bill Polian showed up and said, I think this Levy guy, I think this is the right guy. And as you know, it's really interesting that those years, those Super Bowl years, that team was not in disarray, except I have one story for that. But I also have one story about Chuck Knox. In 1980, they won the division. And they played game 13 in New England. And they lost. Mm-hmm. So we're flying back from Logan to Buffalo. And the pecking order was the coach had sat in first class, and I already explained those staffs weren't real big, medical people were up there and so forth. Then it was the media and public relations people, and then the players. So the last two seats in the media area were occupied, on one side of the plane, were occupied by myself and Mike Dodd, a St. Bonaventure graduate who covered the Bills for the Buffalo News. And we're sitting there. This is a short flight. It's not even an hour, barely an hour. And behind us are sitting Sherman White, defensive end, and outside linebacker Isaiah Robertson, total loose cannon. So what ended up happening when you took off, there would be stewardesses at the base of the stairs. And they would give everybody a bag of snacks and 2 beers on ice to have before the meal was served. So not all the players were drinkers. So the players who weren't drinkers gave them to players who were. So I wasn't scrutinizing them, but my guess is that Isaiah and Sherman knocked down a few. And all of a sudden, on the flight back, they start screaming at each other. And then they're screaming at each other. And then they're standing in the aisle. And I'm waiting for the punches to be thrown. And there were a lot of MFs, and I mean, just a lot of street talk. Well, back then, the Bills only had one assistant, Elijah Pitts. So Knox sent him back. Elijah was just as easygoing and nice a guy as you could ask. And he went back and immediately settled them down. They got back in the seat. Mike and I never heard a peep from him. But as we're getting closer to Buffalo, Mike said, "You going to write about that?" And I said, "No, but I can't in good conscience write about something where I'm a guest. I'm a guest on their plane. I can't." I almost felt it was disloyal. He said, "Yeah, me neither." Well, 2 days later, Mike wrote a story about just that because he made the mistake telling his sports editor what had happened. He said, "Oh my God, you got to get that in print." And but I never did follow up. I never did follow up on that. And
that was really interesting, though, because I wanted to ask you. I mean, you're seeing stuff like that. I would imagine often. Where's that line? What? Because you're covering the team. You're going to observe and report and write and paint the picture of the team, but also, like you said, you're a guest on the flight. There is a delicate balance, I'd imagine, that era of covering a sports team,
Tyler, because the rumor was that the Raiders, who else, not only paid the airfare, but also the hotel and the meals for the writers covering the Raiders. In our case, we rode the flight for free. Obviously, we had our own meals. And we stayed at the team hotel, and we got the team rate. So you'd go to a Marriott, and the room rate was $109, and you'd pay $39. And eventually and I was a little uneasy for that. But on the other hand, I was in a situation where I'm from a smaller paper, and any money that could be saved was great. So what ended up happening was they finally came to us and said, listen, you're welcome on the flight, but you got to pay for it. But they said, here's what you do. You go find the cheapest flight you can, red eye, whatever it is, just write us a check. And that's what we did. And it was handy for me because I got back game night. I mean, I could go home and write from home when they played pretty much anywhere to the Midwest. So it was handy. It was handy from that standpoint. Yeah. But Marv took over, and those years, right through the playoffs, 7 straight years making the playoffs, and 5 AFC championship games and 4 Super Bowls. And, I don't get caught up in, oh, geez, they didn't win. Like, these myopic Bills fans who it doesn't mean anything unless you win. Well, you know what? Those were 4 of the best years of my life. Going the places we did, seeing the games we did, dealing with players of Hall of Fame skills, 7 players over the course of that time. I refuse to say, oh, geez, it was a disaster because you made the Super Bowl and didn't win. And I asked Marv about that one time. And the only thing, it's one of the rare things I disagreed with him on because he's clearly a profoundly bright man. And I had so much respect for him. But I asked him about Super Bowl losses. And he said, well, Chuck, he said, I think we lost to a better time each time. And I'll agree with the last 3, 2 Dallases and Washington. They were a better team than the Giants. They were a better team than the Giants. My God, they had the ball for 19 minutes and 33 seconds. And if Bruce Smith recovers the fumble in the end zone that he caused that ended up being a safety, or if poor Scott Norwood is accurate, it's moot. So I didn't agree with that. But it was interesting to me, in 1989, after they had that season in 88 where they went and lost the AFC championship game in Cincinnati, the bickering Bills came. And Jim Kelly, of course, didn't sign initially, played in the USL for 2 years. Then he came to Buffalo and signed and played in 86. So he's 4 years in, and he should have known better. But they lost the game on the road. And Jim was doing a TV show, and he was bitching about the loss. And he said, we've got a great offense here, but we've got one weak spot, and I think everybody knows where it is. And his reference was to Howard Ballard, who was the right tackle. And Howard was 6'6", listed at 325, closer to 50, and as gentle a human being as you could ever meet. He was beloved in the locker room. And here's his quarterback throwing him under the bus. So there was a lot of feedback for Kelly in the locker room. But the thing that was the clincher was Thurman Thomas, who was in his second year, was on a radio show in Rochester. And he called Kelly out. He just said, you don't do this. And, Howard Ballard, just an old country boy from Alabama. He wasn't some juiced up, Adonis-like, muscle-bound freak. He was just a big human being. And the players loved him. And happily, Jim got the message. And very shortly thereafter, all of a sudden, Jim screwed up. It was all about him. It was his fault. And eventually, by the time he was late in his career, he took the blame for things that were not his fault. And that's the way you make friends in a locker room. And that's leadership. And he figured it out. And to his credit, he figured it out pretty quickly. And that team got its legs back under it and go to Cleveland. And Ronnie Harmon was nice enough to drop a pass that would have won the game, and Clay Matthews then ended it with an interception in the end zone right in front of the goalpost. And I was standing there because back then you could go down to the field in the last 2 minutes. And Ronnie Harmon was probably 12 yards away from me when he dropped that ball, and it couldn't have been more perfect. And I remember him in the locker room saying, well, it was kind of overthrown. And I'm thinking, you better shut up, because somebody's going to walk up and punch you in the face. And Clay Matthews, I mean, you're Hall of Fame guy. He just ended that possession. But obviously from then on, they were an awfully good team, make their 4 Super Bowls, didn't win any of them. But, you know, to me, if you were a Bills fan and you weren't super hypocritical, it was a great time. And now we're getting to the time and the time frame I mentioned to you in the list. And Tim Kelly retired. And now they're trying to solve and Marv Levy retires. And Wade Phillips is coach. And they're trying to solve the quarterback problem. And they have Rob Johnson, and they have Doug Flutie. And this is no exaggeration, and a lot of people who cover the team probably won't admit this. Virtually none of us had any time for Doug Flutie. He's a typical small man's chip on the shoulder guy with a huge ego. And we just didn't care for him. We were very much Rob Johnson guys. And what we liked about him was he was too slender, 6'3", maybe 200 pounds. And he took some brutal poundings, but his courage was never a question. And unfortunately for us, fans loved Flutie, loved him. And so you have to be a little bit circumspect about how you handle it. But I will say this. My old pal, Bucky Gleason, worked at the time. And then
remember this column well?
That column was a classic. And if anybody had any doubts about why we felt the way we did about him, easy enough to call up. Bucky Gleason, Doug Flutie, read it. It's unbelievable. So the battle goes on. There's still the controversy over the Music City Miracle because supposedly it was Ralph who demanded that Rob start that game, and he played well enough. And oh, by the way, they were ahead in the game with basic enough time for a kickoff left.
Shoeless Rob Johnson could have had a statue, right? Like he led a drive. Should have been the game-winning drive.
He did. And Christie hits that kick, and it's like, oh man, this is perfect. And I was sitting next to Larry Felser in the stadium, and we were right where the ball came down for Wycheck. And all of a sudden, Dyson is off, and said, oh my God. So we're still staring numb at the TV, and all of a sudden they show the first replay and simultaneously said, my God, that could be a forward pass. And it would have been in Orchard Park. It just wasn't. You know? And so we watched that unfurl, and Ralph, of course, was beside himself. And he insisted that Wade get rid of Rusty Haven, who was an absolutely outstanding special teams coach. And it was not his fault. A couple of coverage guys freelanced, and that's what opened that lane. But I was convinced, Tyler, that Buffalo was going to the Super Bowl that year because winning that game, they'd have gone to Indianapolis Indianapolis would not have won that game. And as a matter of fact, Tennessee proved it. And they end up in the Super Bowl and come within a yard of winning it. So I was disappointed for Bruce because we really liked him. And ultimately, another special teams coach lost the job for Wade Phillips. And Wade Phillips, I think, is one of the most underrated head coaches in the league. His winning record is fantastic. Fantastic. And here he is still coaching at whatever he is, 76 and in the USFL, and he's winning games and so forth. But Ronnie Jones was so terrible.
He's just his buddy, right?
Just a friend of his. Yeah. And I went back and looked because I was curious. The Bills gave up 3 return touchdowns this year, kick returns, 2 kickoffs and 1 punt. Ralph had seen enough, and Wade said, I'm not doing it. I'm not firing him. So he fired himself as well. But it was an interesting end to his career. And
it's so true on those 99 Bills too. Like I remember doing an oral history on the Music City Miracle, and to a man, Eric Mold, John Holacek, so many of those players said that was a team that was built to win, to get to the Super Bowl and win. I mean, that defense, Ted Washington, Pat Williams in the middle, Sam Cowart, they were loaded. And even if Ralph did make the call, and Rob Johnson's been on this pod to kind of relive it all as well, and he asked Wade Phillips point blank, like, is this your decision? And Wade told him it was. But, you know, Ralph probably entered the equation. Even then, I get the logic. Maybe it's because I'm a Rob Johnson apologist, but Flutie was not good that year. He really wasn't. And you pair a Rob Johnson, his arm, with what he did against the Colts starters. They were in that game that he looked so good in. With that defense, maybe you do have a realistic shot at getting to the Super Bowl.
I agree. Yeah, I was thrilled that he got the call in that game. But by then, I'd washed my hands of Doug Flutie. And it happened in one game. Not sure. I think it was his middle year of the 3 he was there. And we're just so used to him. He's one of those guys who you ask a question, he wants to talk semantics. And this is how this play is and all of that stuff. There's nothing that you can write that people want to read. So they lose this game to Oakland in Orchard Park, 20-14. I went and looked up the score because I knew it was a one touchdown game. Early in the game, he gets Peerless Price wide open deep, wide open. And he misses him. Just like every other NFL quarterback misses guys deep. It happens to everybody. So the question comes up, Doug, what happened on that pass to Peerless? And he said, well, on that play, Peerless is supposed to, and half of us walked away. I mean, that did it for me. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. You can't even admit that you're a regular NFL guy who occasionally misses a long pass and tries to dump it on poor Peerless Price. My God. So
Doug Flutie that day, by the way, 19 of 41 for 210 with a touchdown and 3 interceptions. So right. That was his day.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, I want to mention 2 guys. One is Thurman Thomas. And Thurman is one of those guys who's incapable of lying. I mean, it's in his DNA, which is why I was so impressed. He went to Rochester and just called out his quarterback, Hall of Famer to be, just called him out and say, hey. So anyway, I always had his back. And then he came out of a game late in his career, maybe the last year he was in Buffalo. And he comes out of the administration building, locker room, and two 11-year-old kids stop him and say, Thurman, can we have your autograph? And he's pissed. They lost and everything. He said, nah. So one of the kids gives him a pretty good comeback. He says, Thurman, that's okay. The way you played today, I wouldn't want your autograph. It's a great comeback. Well, Thurman just couldn't have reached any lower because he said, you know why I played so loudly today? Because I was with your mother all night. Nah. Just horrible. You know, you want to say that to a teenager, fine. 11-year-old kids don't do it. And I wrote a column about it. And the Buffalo News wrote about it. But they kind of put it in a city side piece. So anyway, this is the days when you got newspapers. Somebody cut that column out. And he hung it in his locker. And I never stopped going to him because he was such a great talker. But it's hanging there. And for whatever reason, it never connected to him that guy was this guy. And he just never realized it. But, you know, I try to give him a pass on that given the circumstances. But I thought, come on, you just got it. You can't do that. But the other guy is Kent Hull, who I will, however long I continue to cover the Bills, there will never be a player who replaces him in my eyes as the best ever to deal with. Anybody who covered that team, well, Kent Hull was the center, will tell you the same thing. We make a beeline for his locker. And again, this is before the backgrounds with the logos and he was at his locker. And he never didn't have answers. And it's funny, he was a very bright guy, is a very bright guy. And, well, he is not now. He died at age 15, stomach issue. But he just had answers that he wanted to put in print, win or lose. And he was available and he took as much time as needed. And what was interesting about him is that he was eloquent, not in a Marv Levy way, but in a kind of country perspective way. And it's just really fun to listen to him and talk to him. And, I realize there's some awfully good centers in the Hall of Fame. He's not going to make it. But boy, he is certainly in the Hall of Very Good. And as far as we're concerned, he was the best ever. In fact, when he retired, we had a luncheon for him. And we made up a mock page, front page with pictures on. Each of us wrote a little blurb about what he meant to us. And he signed all of our pages. And it was a privilege knowing to him. And he died on my birthday when he was 50 years old. And I was a wreck the next few days because that was just a really quality guy. So anyway.
That's fascinating. Man, so he was just really approachable and would just explain what happened in the game fully with insight, but kind of a folksiness too.
Oh, and I think you've experienced this too, because you've been in enough NFL locker rooms, but as you know, it's more cumbersome than those days. But there's a history of offensive linemen being the best talkers in a locker room because they're more introspective about the game. You ask a wide receiver what happened on the touchdown pass, and you'll get, I gave him a drop step and just went for the post or something. You're not going to get a lot of meat, but a guy like him would explain why it worked. And not only did he explain it, he explained it so, and this sounds terrible, but women aren't afraid to admit that they don't know football. Guys will never admit. But he explained it so a woman would understand it, and it was ideal. So I miss him, and the game has changed so much, and I don't envy you traveling and going to other teams and trying to get interviews. And as you know, the biggest problem we have now is that there's always been this concern with getting beaten on stories But now we live in an age, we get beaten by the star of the story because they put it on social media. How are you going to beat the person who's the story? And it's just made your job so much harder when you're trying to do long form stories and so forth. And I got to say, in my mind, it's not better than it used to be.
No, it's definitely gone a totally different direction. I mean, that's kind of why I launched Go Long, right? To try to zag, go the old school direction, sit down with these players for as much time as possible. I mean, we have a story up today. If people haven't checked it out yet, David Long Jr., Dolphins inside linebacker, just insane life story, everything he's been through. But it took him sitting down for nearly 3 hours, to kind of go down these darker roads. And it's not every player is willing to do it. But hey, I still think there are a lot. I think that maybe I'm just a hopeless romantic in a way, but I think there are a lot of players who are turned off by Twitter and social media and the fact that, something they say can get chopped up and marketed and sold and bastardized. Right. They don't like that. And I think that even the locker room setting turns guys off. They're standing there and the amoeba just kind of moves their direction and they're answering surface level. They're answering in a very surface level way by design. I think if you can get a guy one-on-one, if you can get him to that mental place, like, oh, here comes the bald bearded guy from Western New York and probably going to be sitting down here for an hour or two. Once they get to that place, I think there are a lot of players that still do want to open up because they don't do it as much anymore. It's refreshing to them too. I mean, David Long, he said multiple times, man, this is kind of therapeutic, to relive cousins dying and, a brother basically executed 8 months after getting out of prison himself. So yeah, it's different. I'm with you because even when I first started covering football, as an intern with you guys at the OTH and at the Buffalo News and Packer Report and Sean O'Leader, I'd say, 06, 07, 08, it was so different then to what it is now even. So I've kind of seen the changes. But I think the players and the coaches themselves are getting so turned off by what it's become, that maybe it's swinging the other way. Even on the grander stage with Hard Knocks, it's 2 episodes in and I'm sure things got to be approved by the Giants before it makes its way to HBO. But the access has been unbelievable. Joe Shane is on the phone talking to Saquon Barkley about his contract. They're just putting it out there. So right. Hell, maybe it's a hard change back, baby, to actually showing fans how this league works, right? The fans are the ones taking their paycheck and pouring all their hard-earned money into $70 parking and $150 tickets and $20 beer for what? Just to hear a coach or a player at a podium say a whole lot of nothing about what they just saw out there. They should be the ones that they really want the substance here, right?
Well, I'll tell you what. 2 things stick out to me about the pieces you've done. One is the pieces that you did about Eric. Talk about a guy putting his soul out there. That was hard to read. And the fact that he was so forthcoming to you about where his life was and how, oh my God, I thought that was terrific stuff. The other thing is, and I have a vested interest in this because of what I do, but the pieces on Sean were incredibly well researched. And what made me feel good is that you did something you could never have done at the Buffalo News. You couldn't have done those pieces because they wouldn't have let you. But you were able to make very, very good use of off-the-record comments. And it gave those stories such perspective. But yeah, those two pieces, groups of pieces, really stuck out to me, especially, I don't know how you found your way to Eric. I don't think he found his way to you, but that was a hell of a job.
Oh, thank you so much, Chuck. Man, always appreciate it coming from the legend like yourself. And I really should reiterate here too. I mean, your strength, number one strength to me, and this is almost as much being a young reader and a young athlete. I mean, you also covered me when I'm playing at Ellicottville, so I'm I'm interning with you, and at the same time, you're covering our games there at Ralph Wilson Stadium. Just that's such a wild dynamic thinking back, but you were the authoritative voice throughout the Southern Tier. I mean, whether it was high school football, high school basketball, to the St. Bonaventure Bonnies, to all things Buffalo Bills, obviously, Sabres. I mean, anything happened, you picked up the Times Herald the next day to see what Chuck Pollock had to say.
Well,
and your conversational tone, I mean, you really did write the way you talk to a buddy at a bar. It felt like you're hanging out with Chuck, just talking about the game. Agree, disagree. You had an opinion, and you presented it always in just such a conversational way that I think is stuck with me, right? Subconsciously or consciously.
Well, it's interesting. Jim Crowley mentioned to me one time in his first stint with St. Bonaventure, he said, I kind of look at you the way I look at Bucky Gleason and Jerry Sullivan. When something happens locally, first thing I want to know is, what does Chuck think? But I was thinking about your basketball days, and I don't know if you even remember this, but I was covering a playoff game that you were in, and I was sitting there courtside, and you came in, got ready to come in. I looked back and said, "Hey, Chuck, how you doing?" In the middle of the game, I just started, that's never happened to me before.
Oh yeah, those were the days, man. It was fun, and I mean, it's going to be great. Like I told you, we're actually building a house down with the fam. They're going to be going to Ellicottville themselves here soon. So time flies, but I mean, that was God, that was such a fun time working with you there.
I will say this, and I'm not blowing smoke about this. I mean this sincerely. There are two things I've always admired about you. One is your writing skills, but the other is how close you are to your family and how your family is such an integral part of your life, and you wanting to be nearby and just the life that your mom and dad have carved out. Parents could read about it and learn a hell of a lesson about bringing up kids. I'll say that. And I've always admired that, because it doesn't come up a lot.
That's unbelievably kind. I mean, yeah, always was raised. It starts there. It starts with the family. Mom and dad, it's, love them so much. And it was just like it's like dad was a best friend, but somebody you want to make proud, because I don't know how he found the time, right, to have his own business and to coach us in everything growing up and support our hopes and dreams. I think that's why, as an intern at the Times Herald, I'm sure I asked you this question really early, and I asked it to Peter King when I'm interning, there at Packer training camp practices. And I'm sure I asked Sully and Bucky when I'm an intern at the Buffalo News. But how do y'all balance being a dad, being a husband, raising a family with being at these football practices and games all the time? And you're doing that on top of putting out a paper every day. I mean, you were living at the Times Herald. You were the Times Herald. And I should tell everybody out there, read Chuck's stuff at the Wellsville Sun. And you mentioned the Olean Star. I mean, with what you can get into, please let us know. But I don't know. I didn't know how you were able to balance it all. And it blew my mind, Chuck.
Well, I'll tell you this, Tyler, and it's bothersome to me, although it's turned out fine. As you know, the job demands tremendous amount of time. And I never shorted my kids, but in hindsight, and my ex-wife and I are the best of friends, but I have to say, if I came up short as a husband, it was with her because of juggling all those things. And, and we've talked about it since, and I feel I feel badly about that because I guess I didn't find a way to do all three of them the way I should. And, it's been a life lesson that you see from behind,
Hey, you find a way though. And I think at the root of it all, you're just a great guy. People want to be around you. I know I did at a young age, and everybody loved working for you. Man, I can't thank you enough for everything, Chuck. And this past hour, kind of going down memory lane with these Bills, that was a riot. I mean, I've got a million questions on all of that, so I'm sure we've got to do this again. But who was, you mentioned Kent Hall, just before I lose you here, is there another player that you really loved covering, Chuck? I mean, even back to the 70s and 80s, there's so many underrated guys, like Joe Ferguson, man, tough as hell. I feel like he really doesn't get discussed enough.
No. And Fergie was one of those guys. Bob Chandler was one of those guys. But I will say probably second on this list was Sam Gash, fullback from Penn State. He was the class president, 200 students, went to Penn State, high-class guy, and you did not want to be standing in front of him when he was throwing a block on a sweep. But he was just so accommodating. And this is a guy you knew if he didn't do a snap in the NFL, he was going to be a marvelously successful person. He just did.
Crazy enough, he was the running backs coach in Green Bay when I worked at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and always great in those one-on-one settings too. He'd actually kind of give you something to chew on.
Yeah.
God
bless him. There aren't enough of those players.
Oh, and then also there's a little racquetball history to Chuck Pollock here, and maybe an adversary you took on in that realm. Is that right?
Yeah, Terry Pagula and I played racquetball in a league for probably 5 years. And he was the last guy who would project to be a billionaire when I knew him. When he had this East Resource, he had a successful company, but not that any of us in the league were fashion plates about how he dressed, but probably Terry was the worst dressed of all of us. But I will tell you, when he went to Pittsburgh, he still had his East Resources company also in Allegheny. And he hosted a party for people in Rochester, chartered a bus, and the people in Allegheny. And he went about trying to find as many of us who were in his racquetball league as he could. And Tyler, it was an unbelievable event. The food, the drinks. He had a live country band that played for his record label. And I started talking to people there. And every one of them said, unquestionably, he was the absolute best boss they ever had. And I got to say, I'm supposed to be objective, but I can't be objective about Terry Pagula. I can't. Loyalty offsets my commitment to being open-minded because I like him so much as a person. I know who he is as a person. And so I'm not people can take shots at him and so forth, and he's an easy target. And don't even ask me what's going on with the Sabres. It's a mess. But, Bills ended their streak of struggles under him, under his ownership. And he put together a good team. Clearly Brandon Beane's best move, the very first one he made as Bill's general manager when he moved up to take Josh Allen. But that's a pretty good team. I don't think they're as good as the last couple of years. I had a couple of Bills fans tell me they're going to go 14-3 this season. And when I get done laughing, I say, you mean 10-7? And they're just shocked that I can be so dismissive, but that's kind of where I think they are. I just don't think they're quite the same team as as they were. But Harry's trying to do the right thing. Of course, he's also trying to do the right thing with the Sabres. I'm not a big hockey fan, and I don't even have an answer, but it's sad. You think in a league that size with as many teams as make the playoffs by accident, one time in 12 years or whatever, they would make it to the playoffs. I don't get it.
I know it. I mean, there's just two distinct ways to view the state of the Buffalo Bills now, and I absolutely can understand both, where you've got the 17 years of not making the playoffs and the tail end of that being a clown show with Rex Ryan, right? Just an absolute dumpster fire. I mean, it was, I've said it on here before. I'm really upset that year I was at the Buffalo News covering the team every day, that I didn't take more meticulous notes, because that was a book. That was a documentary. That was something crazy happened every day in there. I laughed with Richie Incognito. Like, he told him, you were about the, 27th craziest thing on this team, right? They signed him. It's so controversial. How can you give Richie another shot? And
he was a model citizen compared to everybody else, when he was in Buffalo.
Right. It's, oh my God. Yeah. And you've got, the ICANN and Polly and the Sean McCoy, press conference after the non-disclosure agreement. No weird orgy thing, he said. No weird orgy thing. It was one thing after another. Rex Ryan strolling up to the podium in the Clemson helmet. It was wild. So I get it. Like, you and Jim Otis, my co-host at the podcast here. I mean, they hire Sean McDermott and they bring order. They bring discipline. They end the drought. This is the best team in the division. They're contending year in and year out. So the last thing I'm sure that Terry Pegula wants to do is change that and risk going back to the darker times, but also can say, well, that's drought brain, right? That's thinking through the wrong lens, and that maybe you should be thinking through, you've got Josh Allen, the best player this side of Patrick Mahomes. Who knows how long he's going to be at this level playing this well. You've got to maximize it now. And they get into the playoffs. Josh Allen plays well enough for them to win. The defense lets them down. You've got a lot of craziness sprinkled in there, 13 seconds and touchbacks and, 44-yard missed field goals and fake punts. And I get it. I think that Sean McDermott deserves the shot to see if he can evolve now. Like, there was some hope the last month and a half to last season, going for it more on fourth and short, letting Josh be Josh. I like the fact that they have some balls in that playoff moment to go for it. Maybe you don't give it to DeMar Hamlin. Maybe you let Josh Allen decide the fate of the team in that situation. But I think Brandon Beane showed this offseason he's not afraid to take some gambles, right? Trade with the Kansas City Chiefs on draft day. Why not? You're worried about the Bills. You're not worried about the Chiefs.
Right.
Do what's best for the Bills. Force your team to evolve. Like, a lot of these guys that they let go via free agency or cap casualties or trade. See how the Diggs thing plays out. I kind of get it, right? You don't want guys, as Brandon Beane told us, like, going in there with the same scars. There's value to fresh faces in that playoff moment. You can't be afraid. So now we see if the head coach isn't afraid as well.
Well, here's what frightens me, and I hate to be a Debbie Downer about this, but Mahomes has been hurt. Joe Burrow has been hurt. This team has been blessed with a quarterback who's a tough guy and seemingly immune to injury. But that doesn't mean he's not. And imagine this team that something even took him out of the lineup for a few games. And, he's going to be 28. He hasn't turned it already. And we know where he is, but the man's game. And he has no qualms about putting himself at risk when he's on the run. And it's exciting as hell. But what if he's wrong one time? And so but I think you were absolutely right calling Sean out on backing him away of doing what he does, because they're best when he's on the run and making that decision. And bless him, yeah. He finds a way not to take a big hit.
We're gonna find out, right? That training camp's starting a week. which is crazy, but it's here.
It is.
And Chuck, this was fun, man. God, thank you so much for hanging out, reliving the old memories from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. That was awesome. What a treat.
You're welcome. And I'll tell you what, it's been a privilege for me to do this, and I was very thrilled that you asked me. It was a ton of fun.
Well, let's do it again, man. Whether you're in Maine or here in Western New York, maybe we get together. Let's go to Meyer's Steakhouse in Salamanca. Let's do it over lunch there. We'll meet halfway.
That'd be nice. Be well.
And because you're such a good person who just gets it. You're not on Twitter, right? So tell the listeners where they can find you, how they can read you, what they can expect this year.
Well, I actually the only way certainly I put my email address at the end of all my stories. I'm not even on the Book of Face. If there's something on there, the wife tells me, "Hey, did you see this?" Well, no, I didn't, but you're telling me about it. And but what I'm doing with the Sun and what I will do with the Star is, I love the idea that I'm doing columns. And I got to say, being at home on game day with a glass of bourbon on ice, taking my notes and so forth, writing a column and maybe a notebook, it's very, very rewarding. And it's the best I could ask at this point in his career. Because when you were working for me, Tyler, I was doing 3 stories a game, doing a game story. And as you know, those are totally passe. I was doing a column and a notebook, which I still enjoy both of those. But it's a joke because people, they get it on their phone instantly. Do you really? And especially when papers now don't print every day. Times Herald doesn't print on a Monday. Now, I walked away from them for a number of reasons. My choice. But I look where we are now. For instance, Bonnie's play a Saturday afternoon game at the Riley Center. You're going to read about that on Tuesday because we have no Sunday paper, and the Monday paper is a 6-page summation, an e-edition, 6 pages, has basically nothing to it. So the idea, I kid about this, and the Buffalo News is in the spot too because of the terrible deadlines it has. And I look at these and I say, boy, this is great. Yesterday's news tomorrow. It doesn't get it done.
It's a totally different world, isn't it? I mean, man. But definitely everybody. So I just saw, oleanstar.com and obviously the Wellsville Sun with, you're with John, right? John Anderson.
Yes. I don't like to admit that to a mass audience, but yes, I am with John. In fact, when I took a walk on the Times Herald, I had an epiphany because I thought, oh my God, does this mean I'm not going to write anymore? I just walked out on May 31st. And the next day, John Anderson called me. He's going to Long Island to cover a softball playoff game. And he said, you got to come to work for me. I said, when do I start? So within a week, it was great. And he saved my butt. I really appreciate it.
He's phenomenal guy. I mean, he's been a subscriber here at Go Long since day one. And ran into him actually Super Bowl week a couple years back and shooting the bull. So it's so cool to see you there with Wellsville as well. And everybody definitely make a point to read everything Chuck writes on the Bills, NFL or otherwise, because your perspective is fresh. It's not stained by the social media cesspool echo chamber, right? You're thinking for yourself. You're not just following, which is awesome.
It's funny. I did a radio interview with Jerry Sullivan before he ran afoul of a little case of misogyny. And he said, Chuck is not on the Book of Face, and he's not on Twitter, and I have great respect for him that he's not. And I am proud of it. I gotta say, the word cesspool is right. It's just the mess you don't want to be. You don't really have much choice because so much of what you're putting together requires input. But for somebody like me, don't need it.
No, you're right. I mean, that's why I do love Substack, right? It's their whole thing, wanting people to take their brains back. If you subscribe to a newsletter, you're actively pulling the credit card out, putting your information in. You're vested into that product versus most social media companies where like you're being inundated with just your feed is almost an aggregation of what they're telling you should read, how you should think. They're picking up on your habits and arranging your life for you. It's kind of a scary place.
It is.
So yes, just enjoy Maine. Please drink a beer or two for us, and let's do it again.
Right now. Okay. Be well.
Thank you, Chuck.
You got it.